Good evening, Mr. Phelps. We trust that you are bearing well, all things considered. Our intelligence sources in the United States inform us of a very intriguing problem and a very significant mission. If you and your impossible mission force team should choose to accept it, as this may require a political solution. The American Congress is commencing hearings to address the public health response to the current global crisis involving the novel coronavirus that had erupted in an outbreak in the vicinity of the Hubei province in December 2019. According to official sources, the original outbreak involved only a total number of 27 cases associated with the Wuhan wholesale seafood market, a wet market that had opened on June 19, 2002. A venue measuring the size of at least 9 American football fields, according to reporters of the Wall Street Journal, and located in Wuhan, a transitioning economy that is the largest city in the central mainland that had transitioned from primarily an agrarian economy to become the Detroit of China. These 27 cases that had presented a pneumonia of unknown etiology, but almost immediately separated from other respiratory tract infections by using the SARS template, apparently comprised the majority of a total of 41 cases, primarily affecting farmers and laborers in this large city that had been identified by January 14, 2020, with the first fatality occurring not until January 10, 2020, at which time medical authorities in China could not yet determine whether it had been attributed to a disease being transmitted from person to person at all, as reported in the New York Times contemporaneously. It had arrived in Seattle around that time. A traveler from the state of Washington in his mid-30s, returning from Wuhan, and according to the New York Times in April 2020, where it went from there left even American scientists befuddled. Finding from a total of 68 trace contacts on a 20-hour flight, a 25-mile share ride, and about 4 days ambling about in the greater Puget Sound area, not even one other person infected. But finding at least 39 other cases connected in genetic sequencing to his particular virus strain, like rifling marks in ballistics, which that traveler could only have by incubatory period timeline acquired as a host while still in Wuhan, which would, according to at least some analysts, confirm infections from the same production batch. Finding no other explanation advanced to date from experts who have been convinced that the virus had been transmitted by droplets, a transmission theory that has since been modified to recognize an aerosol transmission involving fine particles, or virials, measuring between 0.25 to 0.50 microns, according to Dr. John Lipnicki, and able to persist in the air even after an infected person has departed the area for up to 2 hours. Hence, a person could conceivably be infected in an empty room, vehicle, or elevator if there was a sufficient exposure time to transmit a sufficient viral load to satisfy the threshold infectious dose, which quantity, according to the CDC, remains unknown almost 3 years into a pandemic declaration. As intriguing as that may seem, or as it were, appear. The U.S. intelligence community has coalesced around 2 likely scenarios, but has not yet reached a definitive conclusion on this question. Here is their current position. While two elements in the IC lean toward the former scenario, and one leans more toward the latter, each with low or moderate confidence, the majority of elements do not believe there is sufficient information to assess one to be more likely than the other. Curiously, the gentleman you are now looking at, Mr. Phelps, is Ralph Stephen Barrett, a fellow at the American Academy of Microbiology, and he is also the William R. Kennan Jr. Distinguished Professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Professor in the Microbiology and Immunology Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he has served for almost 40 years. Dr. Barrett was finishing his postdoctoral work in microbiology in the early 1980s, just as the HIV epidemic was emerging. And even UNC admits on their website for alumni that might have been a logical direction for his research, but something else somehow caught his attention: coronaviruses. Dr. Barrett of Report had found that coronaviruses jump species pretty easily. And he works in microbiology. And he admits in boast that he had written a couple of papers saying that these viruses have high potential as new emerging viruses. And then, like 2 to 3 years later, SARS emerged. But if, as we shall show later, they have the potential to evolve naturally, a clever microbiologist might be able to help them along their way in evolution to occur unnaturally. As you see, the very first human coronavirus had not yet been discovered until the mid-1960s. OC229E, a marginal co-infecting agent within the cocktail of pathogens that comprise the common cold, and more akin to a chicken coronavirus, according to its discoverers. And while there are over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect the avian species, and over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect the mammalian species, the current novel coronavirus is only the 7th coronavirus to present any threat at all to mankind, the last of which had been at least remotely connected to bat coronaviruses, not chicken or bird, which Dr. Barrett had claimed to have been prevalent in the nation of China, specifically horseshoe bats, prompting his research and interest. And ironically, the source of the first bat coronavirus to present a threat to mankind followed immediately by 4 others, all emerging between the period 2003 and 2005. This is at least an intriguing coincidence. And according to Dr. Barrett, the emergence of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, SARS-CoV, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, MERS-CoV, underscores the threat of cross-species transmission events leading to outbreaks in humans. So, given his interest in this area of microbiology and his obvious accuracy at predicting the emergence of SARS in Hong Kong in 2003, just 1 year before, our sources find it very concerning that Dr. Barrett had in 2002 applied for a patent on methods for producing recombinant coronavirus in the year before SARS had erupted, and since that time has promoted no works to perhaps, as done with prevention and mitigation measures by epidemiologists for insect-borne diseases like malaria and even Zika, help to create some barrier to isolate or contain the source he had identified specifically from human contact so as to have averted these outbreaks before they had occurred. Being proactive, at least an intriguing subject of inquiry, but we shall return to that later. The gentleman you are now looking at is Xing Ji from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically Key Laboratory of Special Pathogens and Biosafety, Wuhan Institute of Virology, Chinese Academy of Science, Wuhan, China. And later in this operations briefing, you shall understand the significance of this association that is of some concern to our sources. And in an article published by the CDC in July 2020 regarding possible bat origin of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, Susanna Liu had identified this gentleman when stating that the SARS-CoV-2 RBD was also closely related to SARS-RA bat-CoV, Yunnan SARS-R-bat-CoVs previously successfully cultured in Vero E6 cells. And in 2013, around the emergence of MERS, Xing Ji had conducted research with Peter Daszak, a British zoologist, consultant and public expert on disease psychology, who is the president of EcoHealth Alliance, a non-profit NGO that supports various programs on global health and pandemic prevention, and pictured here, as well as Ben Hu, the CAS Key Laboratory of Special Pathogens and Biosafety, Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases of Wuhan Institute of Virology, Chinese Academy of Science, Wuhan, China. The other person identified by the Susan Liu report for the CDC for similar work in 2017, along with Xing Ji and persons from the Yunnan Institute of Endemic Control and Prevention, Dali, China, a highly classified military-grade virology laboratory. So, at least by July 2020, the CDC had been aware of works involving coronaviruses being conducted at both the Wuhan Institute of Virology as well as the highly classified laboratory in Yunnan, and were very aware that these two gentlemen, Xing Ji and Ben Hu, who have been associated with Key Laboratory of Special Pathogens and Biosafety Wuhan Institute of Virology, and had some history of working together on this coronavirus project, this bat coronavirus project regarding potentially emerging horseshoe bat coronaviruses, and who had, with intriguing precision, happened to have, in at least coincidentally temporal correlation, distinct admittedly from causation, been involved in the cultivation in vivo, or within living tissue, or E6 Vero cells, of a viable SARS-like coronavirus, which type of work U.S. sources have assessed a low to moderate risk that a lethal biohazard might escape, and certainly a possibility worthy of some level of inquiry and investigation, about which many have been reluctant to perform, which is something that raises a reasonable inference of suspicion. And these two men at the Wuhan Institute of Virology find some connection with Peter Daszak, who is in the business of pandemic prevention and does not make any money if there are no pandemics to prevent, which on all evidence had failed to prevent the SARS outbreak that had been predicted by Dr. Barrett, or the MERS emergence about which Xing Ji and Ben Hu at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had said was their great concern. At least yet another intriguing coincidence one could reasonably surmise, and worthy of further investigation, if only because, according to the Wall Street Journal's Jamie Metzl and Matt Pottinger in a recent article, More than 3 years after the start of the global pandemic, there has yet to be a comprehensive forensic investigation into its origins. And with more than 1 million Americans dead from COVID-19 and an estimated 15 million dead worldwide, that's inexcusable. Yet, for one reason or another, beyond a lot of finger pointing, there has yet to have been any attempt to uncover the source of this mystery. In what appears truly to be a mission impossible from all evidence, Mr. Phelps' messengers Metzl and Pottinger appear to point the blame at obfuscation and malfeasance by persons in the Chinese government. And this may require a political solution. But clearly Mr. Daszak has a history of work with Xing Jili and Bin Hu at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and might be of some assistance in negotiating an amicable resolution to any concerns, having worked with these Chinese officials on prior occasions. Similarly, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that it's probably in China's best interest to permit a full investigation of a potential lab leak. And according to Aaron Blake, a reporter at Axios, there are plenty of reasons to believe China would suffer from adverse findings. Mr. Blake suggests that a lab leak would not only suggest it engaged in a cover-up over the past year and a half, but real people being responsible for unleashing the virus on the world would assuredly lead to calls for accountability. There's not really any mystery here. Who wants to be placed on trial for now potentially having been associated with the deaths of what the World Health Organization has estimated as 6.8 million people worldwide, although the Wall Street Journal suggests the figure is higher, exceeding 15 million. Still, Secretary of State Blinken told Axios editor Mike Allen he believes the international community is clear that we have to have the international community has to have access. And in his expert opinion, as America's senior diplomat, at the end of the day, it's profoundly in China's interest to do this as well, because, look, it suffered too in the outbreak of this pandemic. It presumably has an interest as well, especially if it purports to be a responsible international actor, like the United States, to do everything it can to provide all the information it has to make sure we can hopefully prevent this from happening again. A reasonable thought, yet that was in June 2021, and there have not even been summit-level discussions between Beijing and Washington on this issue, although there have certainly been discussions on other issues, including climate change. At least since 2015, Ben Hu, an associate of Xing Liqi at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has consistently maintained that bats have been recognized as the natural reservoirs of a large variety of viruses. And he emphasizes that special attention has been paid to bat coronaviruses as the two emerging coronaviruses which have caused unexpected human disease outbreaks in the 21st century. Severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, SARS-CoV, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome coronavirus, MERS-CoV, are suggested to be originated from bats. Yet in dual-use research of concern, scientific work can be conducted for the benefit of mankind, but also toward his detriment. And Mr. Phelps, this is the concern of our intelligence sources, for which we have reached out to you and your Impossible Mission Force team to address a convergence of extraordinary coincidences. According to Dr. Christian G. Anderson of the Scripps Research Laboratories, pictured here, as of 11 March 2020, 564 cases had been confirmed in more than 110 countries, with 4,373 deaths. And SARS-CoV-2, he said, it's the seventh coronavirus known to infect humans. Dr. Anderson had suggested in March 2020 that since many early cases of COVID-19 were linked to the Hunan market in Wuhan, it is possible that an animal source was present at this location, but which has yet to have been found. And he had claimed at that time that there are also documented instances of laboratory escapes of SARS-CoV, prompting his attempt then to examine the possibility of an inadvertent laboratory release of SARS-CoV-2. Yet by September 2021, he and Michael Worley had agreed with Edward C. Holmes and 18 others that failure to comprehensively investigate the zoonotic origin through collaborative and carefully coordinated studies would leave the world vulnerable to future pandemics arising from the same human activities that have repeatedly put us on a collision course with this novel virus and others. A doomsday scenario that has yet to have occurred over the 3 years of a pandemic declaration, while the alleged elusive zoonotic source remains a mystery, apparently for even the top scientists around the world. But just as government officials in Beijing, as Axios reporter Aaron Blake has suggested, may have concerns that being more forthcoming may suggest it had engaged in a cover-up over the past year and a half. But real people being responsible for unleashing the virus on the world would assuredly lead to calls for accountability. Similar concerns, given the evidence, may be shared by American government officials and others around the world. And so the question still remains unresolved. And at least according to an email transmitted by Dr. Anderson to Dr. Anthony Fauci on January 31st, 2020, upon his initial examination of the genome, the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, less than 0.1%, so as to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered, and had added that I should mention that after discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Or it was his belief at that time that the virus had originated in a laboratory. And after that email had been received on February 1st, 2020, a Saturday, the esteemed Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci had dispatched to his deputy, Dr. Hugh Auchincloss, a rather urgent email marked important, with tasks to be completed that very day before the end of that weekend. And it appears that the authors of this report, first presented for publication on June 12, 2015, had found the intriguing convergence of Dr. Barrick, the predictor of the first SARS outbreak, who had, prior to the outbreak, acquired for himself a patent on recombinant coronaviruses, as well as Zheng Li of the Wuhan Virology Institute, Special Pathogens Division, who had become absorbed in scientific works involving coronaviruses around the time of the emergence of MERS, and had in fact successfully cultured a SARS-like coronavirus, while Dr. Anderson concedes that there have been known instances where these SARS-like coronaviruses have escaped. Of far more concern, of a pecuniary interest, is that in March 2015, before presenting his research for publication, Dr. Barrick and two others at UNC Chapel Hill had applied for a patent for methodologies for spike proteins for a SARS-like coronavirus of chimeric nature. Just 5 years before, According to a report, it may be possible that one of the horseshoe bats bearing potential for reservoirs of bat coronavirus spillover had once again erupted into an emerging public health crisis, now our pandemic, which just appears to be a lot of coincidences. And perhaps, Mr. Phelps, a suitable mission for you and your IMF team, should you choose to accept it. It seems that certainly scientists who invited other scientists to a meeting to do work at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill would have known the history of at least these two men, and certainly of the patents upon which Dr. Barrett had applied and been granted on prior occasion, just before, coincidentally, public health outbreaks involving bat coronaviruses emerged. This tape shall self-destruct in 30 seconds. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.